merit scholarship to, what's that music college in New York?
Juilliard?
Yeah, Juilliard. He was kind of seen as like one of like the rising stars of that scene. His interest drifted into electronic stuff, and he started inventing his own instruments, mainly different kind of synthesizers and vocoders. He started doing a lot of like children's music. He had a partner that he did a lot of it with, who was like a new age nanny type. I guess you could call her a proto hippie. And I think he did the sort of a public access show with her for a while that was on New York stations. And this is all coming from memory, so don't hold me to all of this. I'm just basing it on notes I did for another podcast a year and a half ago. Somewhere along the line, he started getting this idea for the Lucifer, and this was in the mid-60s. And this was going to be his like magnum opus. It was going to be his escape from the world of children's music, which he had a moderate amount of success in. It's basically a Milton-esque recasting of Lucifer as a more sympathetic figure in making him the fallen angel that was going to lead man into a new age, an age of Aquarius, whatever, typical 60s, 70s stuff. And it was something that Bruce was really passionate about, but the album just took him forever to finish. He didn't get paid anything for it. I forget exactly how he got fucked on it, but I know he did. And it pretty much just ruined his career. He spiraled into deep depression, turned to alcohol. He put out one or two other albums, again, didn't really do anything. He ended up moving in with a college friend from Pennsylvania, spent the last couple of years of his life just in an alcoholic stupor. He was actually rediscovered by early hip-hop guys we talked about off mic, digging through the bargain bins of record stores, finding these bands that mainstream rock and roll had forgotten about, sampling them and repurposing them and using them for club mixes and stuff. Russell Simmons tried to resurrect his career and did a collaborative track with him, but the problem with that is nobody knew who the hell Bruce Haack was. I don't even know if it ended up ever being commercially released. I think it's called Haack Attack, which features Bruce Haack rapping over electronica. And shortly after that, I think he had a heart attack and fell down the stairs and died. He had a pretty miserable end, unfortunately, and wasn't rediscovered till years after the fact, when a lot of electronic artists started picking up on his work and recognizing how influential he was and innovative. A lot of those vocals on this album are vocoded, and that became a big thing in the 80s with Zapp and Roger, and I think that might be why the R&B and hip-hop scene had a little bit of love for him. And then, of course, later worked its way into metal to a limited context with a Cynic. I think the album kind of came out in a little bit of a lull as far as outrage was concerned, because it dropped in 1970, which I think was the beginning of the hippie movement being recast as this dark and evil thing with Altamont and the Manson family murders and stuff. But it didn't come out late enough to get picked up by the satanic ritual abuse panic that started in the 1970s, or to be seen as an enemy by the whole Jesus freak movement of people who were in the New Age circles that were coming back around to Christianity. I don't really know if they would have embraced this or reviled it, but I don't think they got a chance to hear it because it just predated them a little bit. The other thing is, and I think people will probably hear the concept of it, which he described as a psychedelic anti-war song cycle about a battle between heaven and hell. People might hear it out of context and think, well, this sounds pretty, I don't know, countercultural, a little against public norms. But I think people forget that there was actually this glut of occult influenced in new age rock in the 60s and early 70s. You always hear Coven mentioned, and I think Coven, or Jinx in particular, her social media presence I think is part of that. In England there was all these early Wicca practitioners that were releasing old pagan songs, or quote-unquote pagan songs, on record. You had people doing black masses on record. You had bands like Black Widow who would come to the Sabbath. You have Black Sabbath themselves. The list goes on and on and on. So I don't think there was enough void there for this album to necessarily cause outrage, which I don't think was Bruce Haack's intention, but I do think if that had happened, it would have brought a little bit more attention to the album, and maybe it would have found an audience, but that's just not how the cards fell, which sucks. But I am curious to hear your thoughts on this one. I know you're a big Moog head. What'd you think of this?
Overall, definitely enjoyed it. I'll get that out of the way. This is a hard one to put into words just because it's, even now, I can't say there's a whole lot I've heard that sounds quite like it. I think my initial thought was just, what? Kind of response to the first track on it, because I saw electronica as your genre tag, and that gives me a very different impression than what he was going for. Also not realizing that the album is as old as it was, but once I kind of got into the swing of it, the weirdness pretty much dropped away immediately. It just turned into this odd, moody blues vibe, I would say. I really got into it by the time it was hitting track 3. I had a really good time with this album. Genuinely enjoyed what he's going with. It's kind of terrible hearing what happened to him in the long run, because, yeah, a couple years later, I can imagine this really having made a big splash, but I guess it just wasn't the time or the place, and he was suffering from thinking a little too far ahead, which is sad. It was a great album. I really liked that one.
I gotta correct myself in a couple points. I had to look up some info just because I'm paranoid. He did actually continue to make children's music throughout the 70s. It tapered off at about 1978 just because it had been a middling success. And also just wanted to mention two quick notes. He actually got the money to make this album because he started off as a very successful commercial jingle writer. And he gave that career up to pursue this, which kind of adds just another layer of tragedy to the whole thing. Also, if anybody's interested out there, because I know everybody loves them, there should be a clip, and I think it's on YouTube, of Bruce Haack with Mr. Rogers from 1967. He showed up with an instrument he made that Fred actually named. He called it, not a very creative name, but he just called it the musical computer, which was a early synth plus sampler that he had built into a suitcase. But it used sensors, and you could actually just, based on skin touching certain parts of it, not necessarily pressing keys, and had lights as well. I've seen the clip, but it's been a while. I'm probably not doing it justice describing it, but yeah, people should be able to check that out. It should be online. There is also an Electric Lucifer book 2, but it wasn't released until 2001.
Was it written about the same time, though?
1979. I think those last couple years were just a lot of false starts of him trying to make his way back into the industry. He recorded this album called Hackula that was eventually released under the name Bite, that had a little bit more of a dark, twisted sense of humor to it, which I think he ultimately shelved just because at that time he hadn't been out of the children's game for too long. I don't think he wanted to give up his only real potential for revenue. He also did a collaboration with Tiny Tim, of all people, near the end of his life. And Tiny Tim, I'm actually a very sincere fan of. I will probably talk about him on some show in the future, but I'm glad you enjoyed this one. Anything else you wanted to throw in?
No, I think that's about it for me. Okay, my next one is Chapel of Disease with their album And As We Have Seen the Storm, We Have Embraced the Eye. So this one came out 2018. When they started, their title fit them perfectly. It was just straight old school death metal. Pretty good for what it was, and Chapel of Disease seems like a pretty straightforward name for that, being a mashup of two Morbid Angel songs. But by the time this third album came out, death metal's way too restrictive a tag for it. There's bits of prog rock, post-metal, classic rock. The specific term you used to describe them when you recommended it to me, sticks with me to this day, was just Dire Straits death metal, and it mostly applies to the first song, but come on. If you like classic rock and death metal, you're gonna want to hear what that sounds like. This is about the best possible version of that. I know you were excited to get back into this one as well. This was one of my favorite albums 2018 in any genre. Does it hold up for you?
Yeah, it did. I know how I found out about this one. It's through Death Cult International, which if you're listening and you're looking for a good Facebook group, again, that has just a really 99% supportive community. It's metal. It's a metal group, so there are going to be those days. Normally when somebody mentions who's that death metal band, they're Gate Creeper, things get a little nasty, but for the most part it's a great group. And I don't know if they're the ones that described as Dire Straits death metal, if it was just me thinking that just based on the first track, although I think it does. That guitar tone, I think, does come back every now and then. And that's what drew me to this one, because I'm a pretty recent convert to death metal, just because, I don't know, I just always assumed it was always just generic stupid shit. I learned my lesson very quickly these past couple years, and I've gotten into a lot more death metal. And I think one of the problems I have with a more modern scene is I'm not a big fan of revival genres. I loathe most of the thrash revival scene of the early aughts, and for the most part it's just not my bag, trying to sound like a certain period in time. I want to hear new innovative things. And I think the whole death metal throwback, when you actually do go back to the early days of death metal, like in the 80s, and not to make myself sound like a pretentious asshole, but a lot of your demo-only bands, there is so much variety because death metal just appeared. It didn't have much of a lead-up, and a lot of people were pretty taken with it, and a lot of thrash dudes, or doom dudes, or whatever, oh, no, I want to do that. And they tried to play death metal, and in the process of aping a genre that didn't fully exist yet, they did a lot of really weird, strange things. There's a lot of more variety in what the death growl sounded like in a lot of those early 80s demos. There's a lot of weird instrumentation. Sometimes you'll get a little bit more thrashy, sometimes a little doomier, sometimes stuff even bordering on proto-black. So it's not like death metal throwback really necessarily needs to be boring, but I feel a lot of times it is. In between old school US death metal worship and people that are still imitating the Swedish scene, there is a lot of overplayed territory in death metal. So when you hear a band that's really doing something innovative and not just doing their very best to have the word cavernous applied to their music, it's always refreshing. interesting. And I don't want to mince my words here. There is not a lack of that death metal out there. There is a lot of death metal bands doing really cool shit now more than ever, really. But you do have to sweep away one or two layers, I think, to get to it. And Chapel of Disease is one of those examples, because they're not a huge band, but they really do just have that little extra that really pushes it over the edge and makes it an interesting listen. Not to bring it back to the Dire Straits, is one of the things I think that really sucks about the Dire Straits is, particularly on the album Love Over Gold, they were this really weird, jazzy, art rock prog thing that just eventually became more and more boring. And not that I think that Mark is ever going to record a death metal album, but to hear a more experimental band take notes from his guitar style, it's nice. It makes me think of a world that might have been, because I don't think he was really ever given the chance to spread his wings in that vein, because I think that was one of their... Although it's still a pretty successful album, I think it was less successful than a lot of his earlier and later works, and it's also the most interesting. I just wish maybe he could have went a little further in that direction. It actually reminds me, I'm getting off track here, but I think a similar thing happened with Paul McCartney, because you have the McCartney 2, which is one of the greatest art rock albums of all time. Love that record so much. We'll talk about it someday for sure. But I don't think it was one of his most popular, and I feel like he had to go back into that Beatles box, and he didn't really stick with that direction so much. And then you listen to his stuff he did as part of the Firemen, and you realize that this dude is one of the great unheard experimental musicians. I really wish I could live in an alternative history where Paul McCartney really let his freak flag fly on his solo work and just did whatever he wanted. I don't know why he didn't. You have more money than God, just do what you want. But the kind of the double-edged sword of that fame is you have an expectation to meet too. And a lot of Beatles diehards aren't exactly the most diverse musical fans. That's probably the most polite way I can say it. I guess the point I'm trying to get at here is just that Chapel of Disease is a glimpse of that alternative world where popular music got weirder and metal took note. They have another album that came out more recently.
They have a second one in between, which I think leans a little closer to the current one than it did to their former album. I guess that's something Chapel of Disease took into account, because, as I said, they started out as a pretty straight-laced, old-school death metal band. It didn't make much in the way of a splash, and I guess just being as capable, talented, and genre-savvy as they were, figured, screw it, let's just throw everything at it and have a good time. And then you end up with this, and you really wish more bands would take chances like that, because honestly, at this point, I'm way more likely to remember something if it doesn't sound like everything else. You could do the perfect, pure old-school death metal worship, but I'm still probably gonna like that weird band a little better.
I totally agree. I mean, my favorite death metal band is Back to Relay from Spain. Just so weird. But I also think with them, and this is a point that we're probably going to come up again and again on the show, but I think being from Spain and not really having as much of a geographic presence in the death metal world helps. We've talked about this a lot, just in passing conversation, the sort of expectations of a regional scene or a national scene and how that can work against bands, because as we found in just our explorations of metal on the old show, where you can really find some bizarre chestnuts is when you find the death metal band from like Moldova in 1985. Anything else you want to say on Chapel of Disease other than listen to it if you haven't?
That's pretty much it. Feel death metal and you're open-minded, there's no reason you wouldn't love it.
And if you don't like death metal, give it a shot anyway. Maybe this will win you over. Like I said, I've been where you are. I didn't like it at first either, but there's a lot to love about death metal. So, speaking of tragic figures in rock and roll, we're going to talk about, I think, the last album by Jason Molina's Songs of Ohia project. This is where his next band would get its name from, the Magnolia Electric Company. And this is another one I just found out about. I'm trying to think exactly how. Oh, I think I was just fucking around with the alt country, looking for new stuff, because I've really been on a kick for that lately. It's probably because I'm watching Justified on FX, but also I have some history with alt country. I was big into cowpunk in high school, and I also I'm getting older. Maybe I have more of a taste for it. Whatever. Some of it hits, some of it doesn't.
Yeah, this is totally an aside before we get into the album proper. I was thinking back earlier today to a high school teacher of mine who played a lot of country in class, and at that point I was getting into Slayer and things like that, and he overheard me mentioning them. He's like, oh yeah, I used to keep up with them all the time. And I think then, being young and stupid as I was like, what happened to you? And he said, you get older, you realize country is the music of human suffering, and it grows on you. And I'm hitting a weird point in my life where it's like, oh, he might have had a point.
Oh yeah, I feel you. Country, I think, unfortunately, we live in probably the worst possible time for radio country. I mean, I think it's been on the decline since the birth of the Hat acts in the 80s, as they call them. I know Max showed us an interesting take about 9/11 ruining country music, which I think it might be a little bit of an oversimplification, but I don't really know how to approach that subject without getting political. I think traditional country just became alt country, really, because that's where you still find really depressive music. Maybe the religious element has been stripped away. Although when you look at the goth country scene, which I want to emphasize for people that are out there picturing Dave Vincent, that's not what goth country is. It's Southern Gothic country. Now, with that said, some of that is as